Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back, Honors, and welcome back to one of the craziest and fastest things I've probably ever flipped in my entire life. So I'm going to do my best to not get too excited about all this stuff because I know that I'm going to end up keeping you here way longer than I need to. But my goal today is to try and streamline a very, very intense, very, very information-heavy flip into about 30 minutes. And I already have my timer going right now, as you can see that I do. But the big things that we talked about in class today is Russia is going to end up leaving this war, right? They're going to end up exiting the war early due to the intense, crazy, way over the top revolution and civil war that occurred within their borders during World War I, starting in 1917, right? And it's not just going to be any kind of Russian revolution and civil war. It's going to be a communist revolution and civil war, which is very, very important, right? Because we discussed a lot of different things about communism already, but let's go ahead and jump straight into it. Let's get into the causes of the Russian Revolution and the Civil War, right? So the biggest one, or one of the biggest growing ideas behind their civil war, is the growth of communism, also known as Marxism, right? Now, there's a very, very large difference between socialism and communism. We discussed this briefly when we were talking about the Industrial Revolution. Socialism is all about decreasing the gap between the wealthy and the poor while still retaining elements of a capital system, right? They want to limit or abolish private property. They want universal suffrage. They want to redistribute wealth, and they want to create things like social welfare programs like Otto von Bismarck did inside the German Empire. They want public schooling, disaster relief, law enforcement, health care, different ideas and different things that go out there to benefit the poorer classes of society. Whereas communism, created by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, is an intensified version of socialism, right? And they are going to outline their entire ideas in their manifesto, right? Also known as the Communist Manifesto, which is about 156 pages long, and it was written in 1848. Actually, it was written in 1844, published in 1848. Very interesting component of this, though, is that some of you are like, wait, that's way back when we talked about all those revolutions and stuff. That is way back when we talked about all those revolutions and stuff. However, by the 1900s, the manifesto had began to grow very, very popular. And the growth of this manifesto left to some key ideas of governments and other revolutionary figures like Vladimir Lenin, which we will talk about here in a few minutes, growing their ideas of creating this idea of a communist state, right? Creating a communist state that hinges around class consciousness, right? The idea that the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are aware of who they are. So to understand communism, you need to understand those two groups real fast. The proletariat is the working class. We'll go over this in class as well. The bourgeois is the middle class and the capital class that owns factories and impoverishes workers, right? They want to abolish social classes completely in communist systems, and they also want to collectivize the means of production. And what that means is that they want to create systems where the worker owns the factory rather than the middle class bourgeois member, right? They want to abolish monetary systems and give up currency. They want to abolish private property, and they all believe that this mostly is going to take place through violent revolution, right? Now, also, they seek to abolish religion. Communists believe that religion is the opiate of the masses, according to Lenin and Karl Marx, and they also believe in establishing councils of workers that could be recalled at any time. And the state should only exist to shelter the people. That is why the communist symbol, of course, is the hammer and the sickle, which you should already have in your notes because it represents the farmers and agricultural workers and the industrial workers, right? Creating that collectivized means of production. All right, let's go ahead and fast forward through that. And also, another big cause of the Russian Revolution is the dying system of Czarism that is in place in Russia, right? Czarism is kind of like the old absolute system. It is the idea that you have an autocratic monarch that is completely in charge, and they run and function over everything, and whatever they say goes, right? And the guy that is in charge of Russia during World War I, as well as of 1896, is Tsar Nicholas II, the Romanov of Russia, right? The descendant of Peter the Great that we discussed in the 1700s, right? He is weak, he is ineffective, and possibly not that smart, all right? So from what we understand, he is a very terrible leader, and he exploits the people using his secret police, but he does try to do one thing. he tries to hyper-industrialize Russia, right? And as you can see, a lot of historians and a lot of other people don't think that much of Nicholas II. They think that he's not that bright, right? He also, amongst many other reasons, has shown an ineffectiveness when it comes to his rule, right? You can actually see one of these moments in this thing known as the Kadinka Tragedy, right? The Kadinka Tragedy actually occurred in 1896 on his coronation day. His first day on the job resulted in the death of a decent number of about a dozen people that showed up to his coronation because they heard there was going to be free beer and free pretzels and this little commemorative cup that had a gold coin in the bottom. So all these poor workers in Russia that were subject of his hyperindustrialization showed up to see his coronation. And when they found out that there was no beer, no pretzels, and that the police may be coming, they all fled and ended up trampling a bunch of people to death, right? So his first day as king actually resulted in the death of people, right? And also the workers, since he tried to hyper-industrialize Russia and create a larger factory system, they feel that they want Nicholas overthrown because they feel mistreated and they think that he does not care. Also, his grandfather, Alexander II, freed the serfs in 1861, and they weren't modernizing, right? It backfired in his face, and the serfs actually did not modernize, did not move into the factories like his grandfather Alexander II was expecting, and they actually produced not as many They didn't produce as many farm goods. They didn't produce nearly as much food as they needed to, which led to low food supplies, right? And also intermittent famines that actually occurred in Russia. So the guy's got mad factory workers, and he's got agricultural people that are not modernizing. He's got a lot of problems on his hands, as you can tell. And then on top of all that, he believes that he wants to enter into a war against the newly modernized Japanese, right? So in 1904 to 1905, he entered into this thing known as the Russo-Japanese War, right? Yet another cause of the Russian Revolution. The Russo-Japanese War was supposed to be an easy victory for Russia. It was supposed to be something that they were going to enter into during this war, and it was only going to last a short time, and it was going to be over some trade ports in China right off the heels of all the Opium Wars, right? When the British opened up these spheres of influence inside of China and created these open ports following the Opium Wars, the Russians tried to get in on it, and they tried to actually go after this area known as northern China as Manchuria, right? And Nicholas believed it would encourage national pride and help stop any forthcoming rebellions that would try to overthrow his power. But what ended up happening is the Japanese had modernized as of the 1860s. They showed up and they destroyed Russia. Russia thought that they were going to be entering into a war where they were going to be fighting against primitive people, but they showed up with Japanese samurai codes like the Bushido, where they refused to lose in a war or they would rather die. I'm not kidding. It is samurai tradition in Japan, which was just in the back door. It had just modernized as a country about 40 years earlier, so you still had these cultural remnants of the Japanese samurai, and if a soldier in Japan, some of them anyway, if they lost, they would rather die and kill themselves in a process known as subaka than actually lose a war. So Russia entered into a war against that, right? And they ended up losing, and it caused a massive amount of hysteria back home in Russia, right? If you need to pause me real quick to go ahead and jot this whole thing down, totally understand that. But I'm going to keep going, all right? So the 1905 revolution is going to break out, right? So we see several causes. And yet again, this is a revolution that's going to cause the other revolution, right? So the 1905 revolution was a massive failure by the revolters, right? Due to the problems following the release of serfs, the Russian economy is failing. The Kadinka Tragedy, Nicholas's ineffective rule, and then also the growth of communism. The Industrial Revolution created this huge group of working class members, and also the Russian government was sick and tired of trying their failed Russification program. The Russification program was when they were trying to make basically all the minorities in Russia completely Russian, right? They wanted Ukrainians to speak Russian. They wanted Belarusians to speak Russian. They wanted to banish the Kazakhs into Mongolia, and they all wanted to do all this other stuff. So since that program failed and they couldn't actually get these minorities within their empire to convert over, they decided to start purging out Jews, Armenians, Poles, and all these other people that they thought weren't Russian enough, right? So this led directly to the 1905 revolution. In 1905, riots broke out all over St. Petersburg, right? They broke out everywhere, and in one particular event known as Bloody Sunday, which defines almost the entire 1905 revolution. About 150,000 people showed up out front of the Winter Palace demanding bread, demanding courtesy, demanding better treatment in the factories, and demanding that Nicholas read their petition. That's right, 150,000 people showed up due to his terrible ruling, due to the non-modernization and famines going on in the agricultural sector, due to the fact that the industrial workers felt taken advantage of. They showed up because they just lost this war against the Japanese, and they showed up with a piece of paper. They didn't show up with rifles. They showed up with a piece of paper. A petition to give to Nicholas, and they were led by priests. These people showed up on Bloody Sunday out front of the palace and they said, read this and listen to us. And so Nicholas decides, instead of reading this petition, he has the royal guard open fire onto the crowd, and he killed over 200 common people in Russia. And because of this, and due to the national embarrassment, that means that Nicholas must relent slightly. So he decides to do three things after the revolution of 1905, which is considered a failure by the Russian people due to the fact that, yes, they got their legislative body, their parliament, their Reichstag. It was known as the Duma. But the problem with this Duma was Nicholas could dismiss it whenever he felt like, right? They got voting rights, but Nicholas was still an absolutist. So you didn't vote on him, so it didn't really matter, right? So, and then also they got a constitution that Nicholas could ignore whenever he actually felt like it, right? So honestly, yes, this 1905 revolution was not completely in vain, because the 150,000 people that showed up with this petition and the 200 people that died got these three things, but Nicholas still retained a power where he could cancel all of them at any minute, right? So if you look at Russia from a grand scope, they had all these crazy things that led to a revolution in 1905, a failed revolution in 1905. So the people are still upset. They're still furious. And then on top of that, World War I breaks out in 1914. Less than 10 years later, Russia got sucked into a worldwide war, right? Right after a failed revolution in 1905, okay? Following the 1905 revolution, Russia becomes what's known as a police state. Nicholas would put down anyone who tried to question him, and he would use his secret police to do his dirty work for him, right? So it becomes a terrifying place to live. And on top of all of this, they entered into World War I, which caused even more problems because factories could not produce enough weapons to satisfy the war effort. And in World War I, Russian soldiers, many of them had no guns, many of them had no ammo, so many of them didn't have boots, and they had cloth wrapped around their feet instead. And by 1915, 2 million Russian soldiers had already died in World War I, and even more of them were deserting the army. And they were like, I will not fight for Nicholas II. I will not fight for these terrible Russian officers who don't know what they're doing, who would rather get drunk and lead pogroms against Jewish people in our military. Pogroms are actually violent things that they were leading against Jewish members of the Russian military. I would rather die and take the chance of being shot while trying to run back home than fight for these people or join the 2 million people that are already dead. So Russians were really in a bad way. And in 1914, 1915, Nicholas decides that he would help out. So he went to the front lines of World War I to try and aid them in their cause. Like an idiot. Does anyone want Nicholas there? No. No one wants Nicholas there because he's not smart and he doesn't know what he's doing, right? And he became the leader of the military and he's now the absolutist. And back at home, who is going to lead if he's gone and he's at the front lines? Well, the people that are going to be left in charge are the Tsarina, which is his wife, and her creepy, crazy Russian mystic priest, a man by the name of Grigory Rasputin. All right, so that's right. This creepy dude was left in charge with the Tsarina, and we will talk all about his crazy story tomorrow in class because I've only got 16 minutes left, right? But Grigory Rasputin would be left in charge of the Russian government with the Tsarina at his side. Rasputin, because conservatives like Prince Felix here thought that he was leading the terrible war effort and leading to a bewitching moment where he was taking over the Russian royal family, as seen in this political cartoon right here, a lot of conservatives thought that he was corrupting the royals and leading Russia to a terrible place. So they assassinated Rasputin in one of the craziest stories ever that I'll tell you tomorrow, right? But they blamed him for the failures of World War I, and it led to a crazy story that all started actually down here in this basement. And we'll talk all about it though, okay? So the big thing though is that by 1917, let's look at the checklist of crazy stuff that has happened, right? Russia has lost a war against Japan. Russia has an agricultural sector that is not producing enough food. Russia has an industrial class of people that feel taken advantage of. They have the growth of communism going on within their country, and people are beginning to think that the communist way of living is going to be better than living under the Tsarist regime. They have a Tsar, Nicholas II, that doesn't know what he's doing, and people are getting trampled at his coronation day. You have this guy that also leaves and goes to the front line and leaves a crazy Russian wizard and his wife in charge, and then a bunch of royalists, they kill the Russian wizard, right? So the end of Tsarism is going to come to a crashing downfall in 1917 when the real Russian Revolution begins, okay? In 1917, the process of the revolution that leads to Russia withdrawing from World War I starts, okay? People begin to riot in Russia again, but this time they're rioting over bread. Famine has broke out all over Russia. People are starving to death. Russian men are deserting the army and going home to try and take care of their families. So people began to walk down the streets rioting over bread. Crazy little important fact that I think you should jot down and will probably be extra credit on your test is also the Russian Revolution started on International Women's Day. It was actually a group of women that started the Russian Revolution and Civil War due to the fact that they felt that they were being taken advantage of, and they also didn't like that their husbands and sons were being sent off to a war where they were sure to die because they weren't being given boots or guns, right? Nicholas ordered the soldiers, yet again, to open fire on these rioters. But the soldiers decided they were tired of Nicholas and his ideas, so they joined the rioters. And what is known as the February Revolution on International Women's Day, as you can see, started, right? So the big thing, though, that you need to understand, really, really quick side note, the Russian calendar was slightly off. They were not using the Gregorian calendar that we use now. They were using the Julian calendar. They were using the Gregorian calendar. We use the Julian calendar now. Their calendar in Russia, it's about 13 days off. So what they call the February Revolution actually happened in March, according to our calendar, okay? Don't let that confuse you, but it's phase 1 of the 1917 revolution. There are 2 phases, so go ahead around this, jot down phase 1. This is the 1917 February Revolution, when protests spread all throughout the new city known as Petrograd, which actually is St. Petersburg. But they called it Petrograd because it wasn't, Russian sounding enough after 1905, so they changed the name to Petrograd. Nicholas, in response to this crazy intense thing where his military has defied his orders, decides to abdicate the throne. That's right. Bang! Russia is now without a czar. Russia is now without a king. The royals are royals no more. In phase 1 of the Russian Revolution, the king is now gone, right? And this thing that would be established is the provisional government, also known as that Duma, the thing that actually showed up in 1905 after that failed revolution. The Duma is going to be appointed as the new provisional government, led by this guy named Alexander Kerensky. You don't need to know his name. He's not that important. But the big thing about it is the Duma is going to be established to lead this new government. But the problem was that the provisional government was really unpopular, okay? Provisional government, Duma, same thing, okay? The provisional government was really, really unpopular because they actually decided to stay in World War I. Also because they were packed slam full of constitutionalists and monarchists and communists and socialists, and even some liberals were sprinkled in there as well, so they could never get anything done. So a rival government was created in the background, and it was known as the Petrograd, no E, the Petrograd Soviet, aka the Soviets of St. Petersburg. So, and it was going to be led by a guy named Vladimir Lenin, right? So to get you into understanding what's going on, you are now going to see the rise of a very dominant figure in European history. And his name is Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin. Highlight that name. It is very important. What a Soviet is, though, so you understand the name origin of this Petrograd Soviet. A Soviet is a council of workers and soldiers. What you need to think of this as is kind of like a political labor union. It's a group of the people that felt the most oppressed, right? Workers that feel like the czars had left them behind, and soldiers, the people that were all fighting World War I, getting shot, dying, and watching over 2 million of their comrades die along with them, right? The Soviets are going to create a very large attendance to this thing known as the Bolshevik Party, right? The Bolsheviks are led by this man, Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin, as their leader, decides to increase the reputation of the Bolshevik Party, and he believes that a violent communist revolution is the only way to bring Russia to a new ground. And so Vladimir Lenin enters in. So you need to know who Vladimir Lenin is. To give you a heads up, Vladimir Lenin was born in 1870 to a middle-class family. His brother was going to be executed after trying to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. Nicholas's father, right? So he watched his brother try to assassinate the the Tsar of Russia, fail, and end up being executed. Because of this, he begins to write a political protest diatribe, and he gets expelled from college. And then he gets exiled to Siberia, which is the frozen tundra area of Russia, for 5 years. And after he's allowed to return from Siberia, he then moves to Switzerland, right? And while he's in Switzerland, he begins to organize a true communist party of Russia. He takes the teachings of Marx and he alters them a little bit, right? He alters them a little bit and he says that a violent revolution is the only way to bring Russia about, that we need to have industrialism as a part of this, and then also, on top of everything, an elite needs to lead the people. We cannot trust farmers and factory workers to lead this, like Marx thought would actually happen, right? So now you're seeing the adoption of something known as Leninism, right? Leninism is taking Marxism or communism and twisting it to believe that how it would be used in the early 1900s, right? And the craziest thing happens. In 1917, because Germany feels that they will not win this war by fighting it on two fronts, they smuggle Lenin from Switzerland all the way through Germany, all the way through the World War I fighting, and they drop him off in Russia. And they do this on purpose to cause a revolution. They know Russia is unstable. They know the revolution has already started with phase 1 in February, quote unquote. It's actually March. And so they drop him off, hoping that he will lead this violent revolution that they know he wants to lead. And does he? Yes, he does, right? So when he actually gets to Russia, he starts phase 2 of the Russian Revolution, known as the October Revolution. It actually happened in November, right? But the October Revolution starts in 1917, and that's going to be led by Vladimir Lenin. It says VL, not 6, Vlad Lenin. And also his trusted right-hand man, this guy right here, a guy by the name of Leon Trotsky, right? Leon Trotsky is going to be the second in command to Vladimir Lenin. And Leon Trotsky is going to teach Vladimir Lenin how to give insanely big speeches to galvanize the people and lead a violent communist revolution. And he also leads Vladimir Lenin's militia, known as the Red Army, right? So Leon Trotsky creates the Red Army out of straight-up peasants, and they storm into Moscow, and they take that city over, and then they storm into St. Petersburg, and they take it over as well. And the new leader of Russia would be Vladimir Lenin after the October Revolution. He decides immediately to go with his ideas of peace, land, and bread, to feed the people, to give them land after stripping it away from other people, and to create peace by pulling Russia out of World War I. And that's one of the biggest things he does out the gate. As of January 1st, 1918, and after signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Russia officially left World War I. All right, so in the end of January, that's what you need to write. Right here, you need to write down, Russia leaves World War I due to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, right? So how does this affect Germany? Germany can now take their entire forces in the east and move them over to the west to fight the French front lines. Why do the Germans want to do this so badly? Because to give you a little spoiler alert, the Americans are on the way. So the Germans are going to try to knock the Western Front out as fast as they can before the arrival of 2 million American soldiers, right? Now, according to Vladimir Lenin, he led this entire thing so that an elite group of people could lead Russia to prominence. He also, though, is going to do some dastardly things. He also rigged a lot of elections. Ironically enough, after this whole thing went down and after Vladimir Lenin led his violent October Revolution, Vladimir Lenin then proceeded to allow elections to elect the new government of Russia in a thing called the Constituent Assembly. But what unfortunately ended up happening is, since it didn't go his way and they didn't elect enough Bolsheviks to the party, Vladimir Lenin decides that he wants to cancel that and destroyed it, and then just created a military dictatorship under himself, right? So as a process to this, though, you have to remember something. Something crazy is going to go down, okay? Those monarchists and those old Russian military leaders are not going to roll over and just allow Russia to go into a communist state. So what ends up breaking out from 1919 to 1920 is the revolution led directly to a civil war that Vladimir Lenin's new Red Army is going to fight against those old conservatives. And the old conservatives were known as the Whites, and the communists were known as the Reds. So Vladimir Lenin led the Reds, and the Whites were the old way guys, the czars, the old conservatives from the post-1848 revolutions that wanted Nicholas to stay in power, right? Fun fact also, during this civil war, the royal family is still alive, right? They're still alive. Nicholas is actually alive and well at the beginning of this the civil war, and he's under arrest by the communists, right? So the Reds were the communists and the Whites were the czars, right? Or not the czars, but the Whites were the old officers that supported the czars and Nicholas and his family, right? And they wanted to see Russia go back to having a czar. They wanted it to go back to before the February Revolution actually occurred. But the problem is, they're going to what? They lose, right? The White Army was super unorganized. They had terrible leadership. They were all over this area outside of Moscow, so they were attacking from unindustrialized and small cities. They were not coordinated whatsoever. They kept calling for assistance. And the Americans, we actually sent troops to help the White Army during this time period. So did Britain, France, and everybody else, because nobody wanted to see a country go communist. But the Whites, unfortunately, not like this poster right here, are going to end up failing in this war. This is actually a piece of propaganda that you will see on your test of a white knight trying to destroy the red dragon, but what ended up happening? That red dragon ended up winning the story. And another huge reason that you need to jot down really quick is the Reds were just simply more violent, right? The Reds were much more violent than the White Army was. And the Reds actually are going to execute and kill the entire royal family of Russia. And they did it right here. Not kidding. One evening, while the White Army was trying to sack one of their cities where the royal family was under arrest, the Red Army said, hey, to commemorate this grand day, let us go down into the basement. We have set up an area for you. Let us take a picture, right? We're going to take a picture to commemorate this day. Wear your nicest clothing. And they all came down into the basement. And here is Nicholas. Here is the Tsarina Alexandra. There is Alexei, the guy who's going to become a very important story tomorrow. Remember his name. Remember Alexei. Remember Alexei. Do not forget Alexei. But the most famous person in this picture is the young lady right here, the Princess Anastasia, right? They all went downstairs. They were dressed in their finest outfits. This picture was taken, and less than a minute later, they were all immediately shot, right? And Alexei and Anastasia's bodies were not actually buried with the rest of the royal family, which led to a legend believing that Anastasia was actually the lost princess that would be adopted by a Russian soldier later on in a very, very intense way, but that never actually happened. Now, after Lenin wins the Russian Civil War, it becomes a complete communist/socialist state. Now, it's an important thing to note that Lenin was going to become the new leader of Russia, and he would actually have Petrograd, also known as St. Petersburg, changed to a new title, Leningrad, right? Leningrad would actually be named after Vladimir Lenin, and the thing that you need to understand, though, is they're technically not communist. No country has ever gone completely communist. They were led by the Communist Party, but they actually were a socialist country. And a big reason why we know this for a fact is due to this, the NEP, or the new economic policy that Vladimir Lenin adopted. He adopted the new economic policy where he basically blended capitalism and socialism together to bring back petty trade and international trade so that Russia could stay relevant in the modern marketplace and in the worldwide trade networks. He's also going to use some massive political reforms. He's going to create the Bolshevik Party into the Communist Party, and Russia would become the United Soviet Socialist Republics. And we will talk more about them when we get into World War II. But right now, we got another World War to finish. We got World War I to kind of wrap up in class. Y'all did phenomenal. I cannot believe I did this with a minute and a half to spare. Y'all have a great evening. I'll see y'all then.